What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Please be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you end up enjoying this video, doing any of those helps the video to do well and the channel to do well, and ensures I can continue making this content daily for many years to come. If you guys have any thoughts about the video, please be sure to share them in the comments below, as I always read all of them, even if I don't always get the chance to respond to them all. Last but not least, if you guys would like to support the channel further than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and all that, please be sure to check out the join button somewhere around the subscribe button. If you click on that, it will let you join the channel membership for as low as $2 a month, and you get special access to emoticons you can use when you comment, and special icons that appear next to your name as well. No content will ever be locked behind the paywall, it's just something extra you can do if you'd like to support the channel further. Without further ado though guys, we'll get right into the stories, and I hope you guys enjoy them. Have a great day. I used to be a manager at a Borders bookstore. It was a pretty good job and I enjoyed working there a lot. I was an assistant manager who enjoyed when I was the only manager in the store. Because of that, I often volunteered to work all day on holidays and allow the other managers to take the day off as well. This became a very regular thing with me. My first year there, I went ahead and took the opportunity to work on Valentine's Day as well. It wasn't like I was dating anyone at the moment, so it was pretty easy for me to slot in. I agreed to open and close the store, so I was the only manager working the entire day. I spent a large amount of time just taking it easy back in the offices, mostly working on Microsoft Excel sheets for making the schedules for upcoming weeks. I got a page to dial a certain extension. I picked up and called, and one of my employees told me I needed to go over to the security cameras. Apparently, there was someone in the store walking around in a huge bee costume. Naturally, I thought that was quite odd. I went up and went over to the security office. We had 4 televisions in that room, with several cameras that could be switched back and forth between. As I looked over at the monitors, I noticed something over on the camera that was focused in the cafe area. It was exactly what my employee had told me. There was a man that seemed to be dressed in this huge bumblebee costume. He was walking around and bothering the customers. He was also holding what looked like a huge construction paper heart in his hand. I have to admit, I was at a complete loss as to how to handle this situation. I can easily say this was never covered in my management training, nor anything of that sort. I wasn't sure if he was soliciting or harassing, just seemed like he was going around the cafe acting kinda crazy. Well, crazy in my perspective at least. Anybody in a bee costume in a random Borders bookstore had to be a little bit off balance at least. For a few moments, I just kinda watched the guy on the security cameras. He was quite large actually. As he moved around the store, he was sort of dancing back and forth. After a bit of arguing back and forth with myself, I finally decided this must be bad for business. I knew I had to at least go and see what this bee wanted. I walked out of the offices and made my way up to the cash register area. The bee person was just kind of prancing about in front of them. A few people were bent out of shape about it as well. The customers were completely avoiding this man. I wasn't really looking forward to having to confront this person. I tried to get the bee's attention, but he mostly ignored me as he continued to randomly dance around. I followed him around trying to tell him I was the manager and he was disrupting business, so he had to leave right now. Eventually, out of complete frustration, I told him if he didn't leave the store right this instant, I would call the police and have him removed. Well, that got his attention. The bee had a pen with him and began to scribble something on the construction paper heart he was carrying. He handed it over to me, then began to dance right out the front door of the store. Once the bee was gone, I looked down at what he'd written. "Big B says you're dead." It was weird, but I wasn't really too concerned about it. By the time the store closed, I had put the incident out of my head almost completely. I mean, I hadn't really forgotten about it because honestly, who could ever forget such a weird experience? But I also wasn't putting too much thought into it either. I closed up the store and allowed the other regular employees to go home. After I was done counting up the money and setting up the systems, I went to the security office to turn off the monitors as well. When I did so, I saw the man in the bee costume just standing at the front door of the store. I watched him, holding up another construction paper heart. He turned to display it to the camera, and I saw it read, "Remember what Big B said?" He must have been standing there for a while, because he couldn't have known when I would walk into the office. I decided I would go up to the front of the store and call through the doors to let him know I was going to call the police if he didn't leave. By the time I got there, though, he had already disappeared. I didn't know if I should call the cops if the bee-man was really gone. I was really hesitant to leave the store now as well. I went back into the office and watched the monitors for over half an hour. It seemed he wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. When I was finally sure I was safe, I set the alarm for the store and left and locked the doors behind me. I very cautiously walked around to the side where the employees were allowed to park. As I walked around the corner, though, standing just off in the distance was that mad bee watching me. He had been waiting just out of sight of where the cameras couldn't see him. He was holding a knife this time instead of a heart. Those words from earlier rang through my head. "Big B says you're dead." I began to sprint toward my car as I saw the bee rapidly begin moving toward me. Fortunately, I was closer to my car than he was. I was able to get into it and lock it before he got to me. To my luck as well, the horror movie cliche of the car not starting didn't affect me at all. I started to pull my car out. I almost smacked right into the bee person, which I really didn't mind. I shifted into drive and took off out of that parking lot. As I looked back into the rear view mirror, I saw that bee just dancing around like he'd been doing inside the store. In that moment, I thought to myself, man, that is one sick f***up. I wasn't really sure what I could do about this bee man. I guess I could call the cops, but he was in a costume, so I didn't really have a description of him, other than he was a big guy in a bee costume. I highly doubted he would still be wearing it when they arrived there. Any big guy I saw around the store could have been him. Any big guy I'd see in the parking lot in the future could also be him. It made every night at work a nightmare, and I never left the building alone at night again. This story happened when I was around 10 years of age and involves 4 of my childhood friends. In case you didn't know, I'm a 28-year-old female, and I'm from a very country southern state. This was the most awful thing I've ever been through, and it takes place back in the mountains. I was always so excited to see the weekend approaching, partly because I had such a cool mom. She would always take me awesome places with my friends, and pretty much just let us have all the freedom we wanted. The other part was I always got to spend my weekends with my best friends. My friend Belinda asked if she could spend the weekend with me this time. I asked my mom, who said yes, of course. I waited until her mom dropped her off at the bottom of my hill and walked down to meet her. She walked excitedly back to my house. My mom then said her best friend Chris, who's also a woman by the way, called and asked if we wanted to come up to their mountain home for a visit. My mom asked if Belinda and I wanted to go with her. We replied with a happy yes. Chris's kids were Alan and Jay, who just so happened to also be 2 of my best friends. Belinda had a huge crush on Alan, and I was secretly in love with Jay. We left our house within 10 minutes and descended to their home. There was very dense forest for miles upon miles around here. After about 20 minutes of driving, we finally arrived. My mom went in and was greeted by Chris. Belinda and I stayed to talk with Alan and Jay. There were also a few other kids around too. We knew everyone there and talked with all of them. Scott was the oldest, Jay was the second oldest, then it was Ray, and Alan was the youngest. They all kept going on and on about this cabin they had built far out into the woods. It was probably about 3 miles into the forest from their home. The boys wanted to take us down to explore it, and we agreed. I was used to roaming half these woods, and I always loved venturing out into them. I grew up there my whole life, but that all changed after this. We told them we had to ask my mom and use the bathroom first. They sniggered, jumped onto their ATVs, and screamed they were going on ahead of us, and told us to follow when we were done. We go into the house, do our business, and ask my mom if we could go. We were in a hurry to catch up. She said yes, but for us to be very careful. So of course, we raced out of the house to follow them. We started walking down their hill to descend the main dirt road. We had to walk approximately half a mile to get to the road that led to this supposed cabin. All mostly downhill, thankfully, except for the flat main bottom road. We skipped merrily along, talking about the guys as we were going. They always loved to play pranks and jokes on me in particular. I guess since I was like their sister and had grown up with them. I told Belinda I had a strong feeling they were going to jump out and scare us or something. Little did I know I was in for a much different surprise. We walked around another 2.5 miles to finally reach this cabin. It felt like it took forever. This wasn't even a road, but just kind of a dirt path. When we finally arrived, it seemed no one was there. We walked onto the little porch and knocked on the door. I was waiting for one of the guys to just jump out and try to scare us. We stepped back and marveled at the cabin. Jay had really done a good job on it. He had always been into building, creating, and growing things. We finally just checked the door, only to open it and step into a little room. The cabin only had 2 rooms, it seemed. Not very big at all. No one appeared to be inside or in the general area. All we could hear were the sounds of wildlife. We stood there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. It was then that we heard an ATV a little ways above the cabin, not back towards the main road, but further out down the path. We followed the sounds and finally saw the guys. They were speeding off down that path. They stopped long enough to yell at us to keep following them, and took off down the path of the woods. We both groaned very audibly. Belinda expressed concern and just wanted to go back the way we came. It was probably around 3 in the evening, and she didn't want to be out in the woods that late. I, on the other hand, was a true-born explorer. I wanted to keep going down this unknown path. I was thinking to myself that if we could find the guys, we'd be able to prank them or something. I really started to regret that in the end. In fact, I really should have kicked their butts after this little escapade. So we took off after them. We walked for like 2 hours before we realized we were now hopelessly lost. We came upon a fork in the road. There stood a tree with 2 arrows pointing to either side of the split. I forgot to mention it was summertime. It didn't get dark here until around 8ish in the summer. We had walked 2 hours total so far, and seriously didn't know which side to go to. My friend started to panic a bit, and I tried to calm her down. I assured her we should still have some daylight ahead, and that we would make it back with plenty of time. I wasn't too sure about that truthfully though. We were 7 miles into the woods now, and they seemed to be endless. I had no idea of our location. We decided to stick towards the right of the mountain, so we took off. Belinda was laughing and saying we needed to kick their butts later. I laughed and we made plans to get them back. We walked on for what seemed like forever, and somehow ended up back at that split in the road. It was now growing darker, nearing dusk with every passing minute. By this time, my friend and I were totally freaking out. She was sobbing and asking me how we were going to find our way back. I tried to stay calm and reassure her, but on the inside, I was just as scared. We were stuck frozen there at the split, trying to figure out where to go next. And that's when about 15 yards back, I heard a twig snap behind us. I shushed Belinda and asked her if she'd heard that too. She started smiling and was about to call out for our guy friends when I stopped her. I told her to stay quiet for a moment. We continued to hear the footsteps behind us. For some reason, I felt more terrified than I ever had been in my life. I whispered for Belinda to start walking slowly down the left fork. The footsteps kept inching their way closer to our location. We tried to be as quiet as we could, but there were leaves everywhere around us. For some reason, I could just tell that these footsteps did not belong to any of our friends. I had this awful feeling of dread, and my friend started to pick up on that. The footsteps started to get closer and faster. I decided to book it down this path, and my friend followed close behind. I had this feeling in my gut that I was now running for my life, and that if I slowed down, I was never going to make it back home again. We finally reached this embankment off the side of the path, and we decided to climb up it. I tore into the mountainside, and my feet and legs scratched up along the way. We could finally see a barn up ahead of us. It was old and had not been used in a long time. The footsteps still approached us after a brief pause. My guess is they were trying to be quieter as we reached into an area with less foliage. Also, we had descended into these tall grassy fields, which made it easier to mask any sound. I finally realized our surroundings. I remembered this was a family graveyard just up ahead, very old, with very large tombstones, as well as some crypts. I decided that was probably our best chance to hide and get a view of this person who was now chasing us. We ran through the old iron gate and hid behind the largest tomb we could find. It grew very quiet as we stood there frozen. My mind was racing. My body was shaking. My heart was beating beyond control. Who was this chasing us? What did they want from us? I had so many questions. We sat there for what felt like an eternity. It gave us a chance to calm down and correct our breathing and cool down from our run. We finally decided to stand up and peek out so we could see if anyone was still around us. We crept up slowly, still crouching behind the graves. What we both saw literally just about made us pee our pants. There, at the entrance of the cemetery, stood a man. Someone about 6 foot tall, who appeared to be very heavy set, wearing all dark clothing. His eyes were dark and wild. He was searching the entire graveyard with his eyes, clearly trying to listen for us. We both immediately ducked back down out of sight. We started to breathe heavy again. We were scared to death he'd just seen us. Belinda shot me a look as the man started to rustle around. I peered up again, only for his gaze to directly meet mine. He turned his body towards our hiding place, locked his gaze upon me, and smiled the most wicked smile. Then he called out, "There you are." I didn't even hesitate. I screamed and we both jumped up and started running back toward the cemetery fence. The man started to chase behind us. Lucky for us, the cemetery had a very short fence, so we hopped over and began to run the direction of their house. It was close by now. We ran out of the clearing and reached the gravel road. We didn't slow down, stop, or look behind us. We ran as fast as we could towards their house. The gravel was loud beneath our feet. We made it part ways there. At the bottom of the road, the boys all stood there looking very worried. We ran up to them so fast they nearly jumped out of their pants. I stumbled into Scott's arms crying, with Belinda right beside me crying too. Both of us looked a hot mess, bleeding from the earlier climb, sweaty with our appearance very disheveled. We suddenly turned, remembering the reason for our panic. There was a man running back towards the graveyard behind us. Scott, Jay, and Alan were all screaming and started chasing after him, but we never saw that man again. The boys tried to chase him into the woods, but they just couldn't catch up with him. They came back and walked us to the house instead. Everyone started crying. They were feeling very bad for trying to mess with us earlier. Our parents were of course waiting on us scared to death. Jay and the boys admitted to leaving us behind and taking off in the woods. They thought it was funny and that we would find our way back on our own. As it grew later though, they began to worry about us and had gone back through to try and search for us, only they couldn't find us. They went to all of our parents and admitted what they did. They went all to search for us and started to panic when they still couldn't find us. Chris had actually been on the phone with 911 when we finally arrived, about to send out search and rescue. We'd been gone for close to 5 hours. We told them the whole story, and about the man who followed us as well. Police showed up to question us all and asked for the man's description. They searched through the woods and the mountain as well, but it seemed there was no trace of him. The boys all got grounded for playing their tricks. They were honestly as shook up about it as we were, though. They thought they'd never see us again. They were scared because it was getting dark, and they felt guilty about that man. Everything seemed to be their fault. Needless to say, though, in the end we forgave them. I never did go back to that cabin, though, or to that part of the woods ever again. Once upon a time, I worked as a supervisor at a fast food restaurant. If you've ever done that before, you know there are all sorts of challenges that come with it. The one that annoyed me the most, though, was when we didn't have enough people to run the restaurant. A lot of times this was because of turnover, but not always. It also was because there were just times when you were not given enough people to work with. When I would close the store in the evening, I was given 3 employees to work in with me. This was one person to grill the meat, one person to make sandwiches, one person to make fries and hand out orders in the drive-thru, and me to take orders from the drive-thru as well, collect money from the customers at the window, and take orders in the dining room of the store too. Frankly, my boss was a big wuss, and he would always overstaff one of his other supervisors who was a lazy ass. Because of that, I ended up having to do a lot more work for a lot less money myself. This eventually led to me leaving the company altogether, even when they offered to move me up, give me a store of my choice to work in, and nearly doubled my salary. Just not worth the hassle. Of course, when you don't have enough people working in a restaurant, it's very easy to get some pissed off customers. There was this one particular night when just everything was going wrong. It was really driving me off the deep end. First off, our restaurant served baked potatoes. These take at least an hour to cook, and because of that, it was very possible to run out of them. You can never actually predict how many someone will buy at any given time, and late this evening, we just ran out because we had so many orders. There were these guys in a pickup truck who were really angry about this. I tried to apologize and explain the situation, but they just weren't having it. They began to insult me, and even when I offered something else in return, they turned it down and began to throw things at me. Then they drove away, only to come back and drive around the store over and over, enough to set off the drive-thru over and over again just to torment me. Finally, I threatened to call the police if they didn't stop doing this. When they didn't believe I would go through with it, I picked up the phone and dialed the police. Finally, they drove off. At that point, I walked up to the front counter, because there was a family standing there as well. When I got there, the man sent his family out of the store and began to scream and yell at me because I wasn't at the front counter the very moment he'd reached it. He even told me himself he had been there for less than a minute, but he shouldn't have had to wait even 1 second to be greeted and served. Again, I apologized, but the man would hear nothing of it. He began to scream at me, "Do you know who I am?" over and over and over. Of course, I didn't know who he was, nor did I even care. Came to find out much later he wasn't anyone of significance anyway. I could be very patient with people, but when he began screaming obscenities at me and threatening me, I had enough and asked him to leave. He leaned over the counter with wide eyes and asked me, "Oh yeah? And who's going to make me leave the store?" I picked up the phone. I give free food to the local police department every single day, you know. If I call them right now, how quickly you want to guess they'll get here? Why don't you leave? The man did leave, still threatening me the entire way out. Then he violently drove his car out of the parking lot, as if he was making a point by doing so. From there on, I just tried to shove it all out of my mind, although I was so pissed off it was hard to focus. Thankfully, the rest of the night passed on much more peacefully. Eventually, 1 a.m. came along and we closed the place down. I let everyone else out of the store, while I finished up the paperwork for the night after the place was cleaned up. That normally would take about half an hour or so. As I was leaving the store, I set the alarm and locked the door. I began to make my way over to my car, but as I was doing this, I suddenly heard a voice right behind me. "How are you going to call the police now?" the voice whispered in my ear. Turning around, I saw that man from earlier, the one I had thrown out for the threatening behavior. He had something in his hand as well. This was the late 90s. I didn't have a cellular phone, so I couldn't just whip it out and call the police. The man had this crazy look in his eye. I knew he was even more angry than he had been at the store. I was worried about what he was going to do. It looked like he had a wrench with him. I guessed he meant to bludgeon me with it or something. The only thing I could think to do was grab out my car keys. I quickly sprinted over to my car and opened the door, with the man chasing right after me. I hopped into the car with nary a moment to spare and slammed the door right as the guy slammed his wrench against the side of my car. It smacked against my car door, putting a huge dent in the side of it. The guy tried to smack my car even more. I started it as quickly as I could and slammed it in reverse. He tried to move behind me even, but I quickly let him know I had no problem running him over with my car if he continued his assault. I clipped his knee as I pulled out, and he stumbled over on himself. I shifted into drive and drove straight to the police station. That guy had made one really big mistake though. Remember how he kept asking me if I knew who he was? Well, because he'd done this so often, I remembered his full name because I was so upset by him being a little shit. The police were easily able to find him and arrest him. The moron even kept the wrench he hit my car with, which was easily proven to have been the one that did it. Needless to say, I didn't work in the restaurant business much longer, and once I finally left, I never went back. This was a strange encounter. It was very scary at the time, but when I tell people this story now, they usually don't think it was something to freak out about. Last Thanksgiving, I was driving home from college with my friend. Both 21 at the time and both women. I live in a very isolated part of Arkansas, which requires driving through an hour of hairpin turns through the mountains. There are a lot of blind turns, and the whole time you're driving on the edge of these huge drop-offs with no barriers. I'm usually pretty confident about driving through these mountains, but we were in my friend's car this time. I was going slower than usual to compensate, driving only 5 over the speed limit. Almost as soon as we started the roughest part of the drive though, another car started tailgating us pretty close. This was really stressing me out. As soon as I saw somewhere to pull over, I did. I pulled into a church parking lot and my friend offered to drive the rest of the way. I declined though. It was completely dark out now, and she had never driven this route before. We got back on our way, only for me to have to abruptly stop a few minutes later. There was now a car parked across the middle of the road, not on the shoulder at all, just stopped dead in the middle, blocking everything off. My friend suggested they must have broken down but couldn't call a tow because there was no cell service in this area. Immediately though, I got a bad feeling. I locked up the doors. I told my friend to stay in the car no matter what. She was starting to get scared at this point and pointed out she thought it was that same car that had been following us. I couldn't quite tell in this lighting, but I was very scared at this point. It was parked just before a hairpin turn, so I couldn't pass it either. My friend started frantically telling me to go ahead and go by, but I didn't want to get hit by a Mack truck or something and fly off the mountain. I honked my horn to get their attention. Nothing happened. No chance of calling for help either, as there was no cell service. We waited there for a while, wondering what to do. My friend was crying and freaking out. I was too scared to try and pass them and end up falling off. I honked a few more times. Eventually, a guy got out of the car. He walked around back and leaned against his car and just stared at us. My friend was freaking out even more. I'm just frozen there, telling her not to make eye contact. I was ready to floor it if he did anything, but he just stood there staring, not checking his car, not doing anything, just staring directly at us. I tried to stay calm and prayed that another car would come along soon. This seemed to go on forever, but was probably 15 minutes or so. He was just casually leaning there looking at us. Eventually, we saw car lights in our rear view. The guy then jogged to his door and hopped back in. He sped off, going dangerously fast. It seemed there had been nothing wrong with his car. I started driving myself, not wanting to cause a wreck or accident. We didn't see anything else for a while. We did pass that same car though, parked along the highway a while later. It pulled back in and started tailing us again. I tried to speed up and get rid of him, but he just kept on following us. We had cell service at this point. I didn't know if we should call the cops, because he hadn't really done anything yet. Instead, I called my home and told my brothers what was going on and to wait on the porch for us. The car followed me all the way home down the really long drive to my house. When we got to my house, my 2 brothers were waiting on the porch, holding their rifles. I pulled in and the car went to the end of the drive, looped around and sped back off the way it came. We tried to see its plates, but we couldn't make them out in the darkness. My friend and I were really freaked out. But for some reason, whenever I tell my other friends this story, they don't seem to think it was a very big deal. I'm a female. When I was 16, I lived in the Valley area of Los Angeles, many years ago. As I explained in an earlier story, at this point in time, the best part of my week was Saturday nights, when I would meet my friends at our beloved under-21 nightclub to dance the night away. The vast majority of the time, I'd have to get a ride there and back. I didn't own my own car until a couple of years later, when I was already in college. Occasionally, a family friend would lend me his car, and on one of these Saturday nights, he did just that. I felt so independent and free to be able to take myself to the club and to be able to leave whenever I wanted as well. On the night of this particular story, I drove to the club and had a typically great time, dancing with my group of friends to music like Prince and Earth, Wind and Fire. At the end of the night, I got into my borrowed car and headed toward home. In case you didn't know this, the San Fernando Valley is made up of many suburban towns. None are very small, and some are very nice. As you'd expect though, some are less nice, with a higher crime rate. I lived with my family in a medium town in the northern part of the valley. Neither very nice nor very bad, with medium homes on mostly respectably, if not professionally, manicured lawns. Being the greater Los Angeles area, there were many differing routes I could take to get home. Freeways, highways, city streets. It was well after midnight at this time, but most routes I could take would still be bustling on a Saturday night. I'd had my fill of loud music, laughter, and chattering voices, so I opted to take a quieter route home. I took some busy streets, but then veered off into some quieter neighborhoods that would take me home eventually. If I drove through these quiet house-lined streets, I'd surely get home a little faster with no traffic. I was really tired anyway. GPS had not quite been invented at this time, nor even cell phones really. Instead, I had to rely on a written map, or just knowing the chosen route. I'd heard some bad things about a town called Pacoima, but I'd only really been through it during the day, and maybe once at that. Still though, I knew a route through there would shave a few minutes off my return time. Besides, being someone used to walking or taking buses, I felt blissfully and perfectly safe in a well-running car with plenty of gas in the tank. I was safer at this moment than at any other point in time. At least, that's what I believed. Still, I was a teenage girl alone after midnight, in an area I was unfamiliar with. I was naive enough to think nothing bad could get me in a locked car. This is when I entered a residential street in Pacoima, and only had to go a couple of blocks through to get to the next town, then to my own. As I drove down a dark, quiet avenue of modest homes, there were streetlights illuminating the unknown. This also helped with my feeling of invincibility. As I smiled to myself, enjoying the quiet night, I noticed a few people walking down the street towards me now. At first, I didn't give it too much notice. My left turn out of Pacoima was coming up just ahead anyway. But as they got closer, I realized it was not just a few people. It was a gang of 12 to 20, and they weren't casually walking down the sidewalk either. They were running down the middle of the street, right toward me. I had to suddenly slow down as to not run them over. This is when they all got a real good look at me. I could see they got instantly excited and animated as they realized I was a young girl all alone. Many exchanged smiling glances between them. Others were whooping and whistling as they started to surround me. Smoothly and effortlessly, as if they'd rehearsed this many times, several stopped me completely by standing in front of my car, putting their hands on the hood, as others walked around my driver and passenger doors and tried to pull at the handles to open them. I didn't always remember to lock the doors when I drove, and cars didn't have auto locks back then, but I was thanking God I'd had the foresight to remember on this night. Of course, this all happened very fast. In my shock and terror though, it felt like slow motion. I quickly adjusted my mind from carefree to possibly being abducted or worse by this large group of people. They had me completely trapped now. I couldn't drive forward, nor could I reverse. This time, the car was completely surrounded, as a couple of them picked up sticks or other objects to try and bust in my windows. I knew I had to do something right now. I did the only thing I could think of. I started to drive forward. Having blocked off my car completely, I could see the surprise on their faces. They knew they had to move out of my way or risk being run over. I immediately decided that if they didn't move now, I would be running them over. All the men standing in front of my car quickly jumped out of the way, and I sped up as I took the left turn out of there. I did make it home safely in the end, but my heart didn't stop beating out of my chest for the rest of the night. Of course, I thought about it for a long time after as well. I was proud of the way I'd handled the situation, but I also kept running through possibilities of what I could have done better next time. What if they hadn't gotten out of the way, and I'd had to run them over with my car? Would I have been able to live with myself? Should I just have sat in place and honked the horn to wake up people in the homes around me? What if the men had pointed a gun at me? I'm very happy it turned out the way it did, but it could have been so much worse. We all have to keep in mind that we're not quite invincible inside a car, no matter how cozy even heated leather seats may make us feel. Dark, quiet shortcuts are not a good idea, especially late at night, and always remember to keep your doors locked when you drive. My junior high school crush was named Adam. Yes, I'm a guy, and yes, I am gay. I was out at the time, and no one really had much of a problem with it seemed. I mean, there was always going to be some jerks around who'd make some lame comments or throw stupid insults at you for something you had no control over, but for the most part, no one really gave me a hard time. Although I had a huge crush on Adam, I was never disrespectful about it, and I was positive that he never knew. A lot of guys always freak out that they may be in the locker room being stared at by a gay guy or whatever. Well, if you were, it wasn't going to be me. I hated the whole locker room experience. Mostly I'd just do my thing, change, and leave. I tried not to stare too long when I saw him in the hallway either. When you have a crush on someone, it's best to not make them uncomfortable. I was already very happy just having my crush and knowing that he would never know about it. My best friend Tammy, though, thought I should just tell him that I liked him. She told me that everyone in the school knew I was gay anyway, so what could it hurt in the end? If he wanted to kick my ass for being gay or whatever, he would have done it a long time ago. At worst, he'd just tell me that he didn't like me back and wasn't interested. I'd be heartbroken for a little while or whatever, but at least I'd have it out of my system. Well, despite Tammy's encouragement, I never had the courage to go through. She wasn't as shy about it as I was, though. One day in the cafeteria, about a week before Valentine's Day, she actually just went up and told Adam that I liked him. I didn't know what his reaction was. I was too embarrassed and humiliated to stay for it. I very quickly ran out of there. For the next week, I just did my best to avoid him altogether. Tammy told me that Adam hadn't believed her and hadn't said much else. I don't know, seemed like a weak explanation to me. He was obviously uncomfortable with the revelation, and Tammy's idea had backfired. Now I was too shy to even look at him at all. Tammy apologized profusely, of course, but she insisted it was better to know that he was not interested for sure. I wasn't so convinced, though. On Valentine's Day, I left the school right after it let out without talking to anyone, not even Tammy. There was this small wooded area behind the school I used to go through on my way home. As I was walking up to it, though, this time I heard someone call out my name from behind me. Looking back, I was very shocked to see Adam running up to me. My heart started beating rapidly, more out of fear than anything else, honestly. When he got up to me, though, he had this huge smile on his face. "Thanks for stopping," Adam said, smiling at me. "I wanted to give you something." "What is it?" I asked, still thinking it was going to be a knuckle sandwich. Adam reached into his book bag and pulled out a heart-shaped box of Valentine's chocolates. I'd be happy if you'd share some of these with me." I was so overjoyed I couldn't even respond. All I could do was nod with the biggest eating grin in history spread across my face. Adam and I sat down behind a tree. He opened up the box of chocolates and held them out to me. I took one and ate it. He set the box on his lap as he talked to me. Once I was done with the first piece, he offered me another. He talked about more things to me, but at this point I could barely understand a word he was saying. I was so elated. By the time I'd gotten 5 pieces in, I was giddy as hell. It was then that I took note that Adam hadn't eaten a single piece of the candy. I looked over at him as he was talking and realized I really had no idea what he was even saying to me. It wasn't that I was so elated I didn't understand. I could see his lips moving, but I couldn't understand any of the words he was saying. As I laid back against the tree, I saw Adam reach over to me. He grabbed my jacket and began to pull it off me. Everything seemed to disappear for a moment. I can't really explain it. It's like nothing was there. I couldn't tell if it was a short time or a long time or no time at all. I opened my eyes. Adam had taken my shirt off and was pulling my belt off and unbuttoning my jeans. I was confused. Did Adam just slip me a date or drug? He knew I had a crush on him. Why did he think he needed to slip me anything? He began to pull my jeans off, and that was really the last thing I remembered. When I began to come around, I felt very weird. At first, I had no idea where I was or how I'd even gotten there. There was some pain in my groin, but the confusion was worse. I looked around. I was alone, and it was pitch black. I appeared to be naked as well. As I looked down, my head cleared, and I could see why I was in pain. My crotch was completely covered in ants. Looking at the ground, I saw a huge column of them on their way to and from me. I tried to get up, but I was too groggy at first. I tried to shoo the ants off as well, but I was sticky. I didn't know what they were doing to cause so much pain. I tried to get up, and when I first did, I landed on my arm against the tree, breaking it. The pain helped me become a bit more aware, though. I got up and shooed the ants off me still, although it didn't do any good. It seemed I wasn't too far away from the school. I looked around, but I couldn't find my clothes anywhere. The only thing I had to cover myself with was the leftover Valentine's Day box. I ignored the pain in my crotch and my broken arm, holding the box over me and running to the school. A few people saw me and laughed their asses off. I finally made it, though, and was taken to the nurse's office and then to the hospital. Unfortunately, once I got cleaned off, my crotch was very red and very sore. It looked like there was going to be some permanent scarring once it healed. It didn't seem like there was any major damage to the organs themselves, fortunately. Apparently, Adam and his buddies hadn't planned this out very well. My arm was put into a cast, of course, my first one ever. I was too embarrassed by the whole thing to even tell people Adam had done it. I kept the explanation to myself. For nearly 2 weeks, I was in complete pain whenever I walked around. I had to take the laughs of my peers, but nothing hurt worse than the laughs of Adam and his friends whenever I saw them from then on. The worst part of this all was 5 years later. I saw Adam again, dancing in a gay bar. So I guess he actually was gay, which made this whole gay-bashing incident even worse. I was still pissed at him for what he did. Fortunately, though, I knew some big, strong guys who were good friends of mine, and they weren't opposed to helping me get some revenge on my high school crush. I used to go to this bar that was a bit on the seedy side, I guess I'd say. It was one of those bars that was just sort of set in against the side wall of a building. It had a very small inside, a jukebox, and a ton of neon signs. There were also, of course, a bunch of regulars who came in there every night. Very seldom did anyone new come in, actually. I was one of the very few women who did, though I only came in about once a week on Fridays after work just to relax a bit. Around Christmas time one year, a new guy came into the bar. He was attractive enough, and there was some interest right away. I had a boyfriend, though, who I was very happy with. After looking at me across the bar for more than half the night, he finally approached me and offered to buy me a drink. I declined and let him know I was already in a relationship and I didn't really want to sleep around. He insisted he didn't want to sleep with me. He only wanted my heart. Every week when I made my way over to the bar after work on Friday, he would be there on the spot. I learned that his name was Charlie, and he seemed to be new in town as well. He came up to talk with me each time I was there. He would always ask me if I had broken up with my boyfriend yet, and when I told him we were still together, he would ask why my boyfriend wasn't there with me. I let him know that my boyfriend worked later than I did, and I always came here because I knew the bartender anyway. I don't think he really believed me though. He would just keep on talking to me. It wasn't too irritating at first. I supposed it was kind of flattering he was interested in me, but each and every time I came in for my drink on Friday, he would ask me right away if I'd broken up with my boyfriend yet. And he would always emphasize that part too, yet. It began getting very uncomfortable on Valentine's Day that year. My boyfriend happened to have the day off work, so he decided to go with me to the bar this time. It was actually really nice. The two of us were just having a relaxing drink together. When Charlie came into the bar and saw me with my boyfriend, I could tell right away he was not pleased. Rather than come up to me though, he just kinda glared at us from across the bar. He had the worst look on his face, and even with a couple of drinks in me, I was feeling very uncomfortable. After a few hours had passed by, Charlie finally approached us. With my boyfriend right there beside me, he asked me if I'd broken up with him yet. Brandon, of course, took offense to this, and Charlie began to laugh in his face. He pushed Brandon down onto his bar stool and told me, "Why are you dating this pansy?" Of course, Brandon got up and pushed Charlie, who then pulled out a switchblade. The bouncer was immediately over there and completely manhandled Charlie as he threw him out of the bar. All the while, Charlie just kept screaming that all he wanted was my heart. Even though I was sure Charlie would never be allowed to come back to that bar, I stopped going there altogether. I had been a regular for years, but that experience completely ruined it for me. Many months passed by after, and I'd mostly dismissed the situation with Charlie by now. I'd had a very stressful situation at work though, and I really needed a drink. I figured enough time had passed and it was unlikely Charlie would be allowed back into that bar. So I went to go have a few drinks. The bartender asked me why I hadn't been in for a while, and I just told him I'd been really busy. After having had my fill, I was ready to head on home. Upon arriving, I went to bed pretty quickly. While I was sleeping though, I was suddenly woken up by a strange thumping noise. It was a very rhythmic knocking sound coming through the wall of the house. At first, I tried to ignore it and tried to go back to sleep as well. I'd only dozed off for a very short period of time before the noise woke me right back up. I was a little bit too tired at this point to be scared or concerned. I kept on trying to go back to sleep, but it just wouldn't happen. When this repeated rhythmic sound never stopped, I got up and looked over at the window. I screamed. Charlie was standing at my window looking in at me, holding some kind of animal heart in his hand. He was thumping the side of the wall with his other hand, and he had written in blood on the window, "All I want is your heart." I quickly ran to the phone and dialed 911. The police got there quickly as well, but Charlie had already fled. Fortunately, they picked him up only an hour later. He was charged, but there wasn't much they could really get him for. He insisted it was just a sick way of trying to woo me. It wasn't long before he was set free as well. The man made my life a living hell from then on. He would show up all the time, especially when I least expected it. He never really did anything. He would always just indicate he wanted my heart. I was in hell because I couldn't afford to move, and my boyfriend couldn't always be with me. I had to get a concealed carry permit to protect myself, but I always had to watch it anyway. I never knew when he'd just appear, and I never knew when he would actually do something to me either. A lot of times, the anticipation of something happening to you can be worse than it actually happening. I'm a female, and when I was 16, I hung out mostly with a group of small friends. Toby was the gay one. John was a small guy who posed at being real macho, and there was a foreign exchange student from Spain named Maria. At the time, both John and I had a bit of a crush on Maria, since she was bisexual. This meant we both attempted to impress her any time an opportunity arose. This leads directly into the story. One night in October, we were all hanging out at Toby's house, smoking some weed like the fly little shits we were. Maria said that she wished she could do something scary, since Halloween was close by. It was also her first time in the States as well. Me, being the absolute coward that I am, loved the idea of doing scary things like ghost hunts and stuff, but actually doing them was a different thing entirely. Still though, I wanted to impress her with my bravery, or I suppose my stupidity, however you choose to look at it. I suggested going to this place called Spider Gates. It's an old cemetery in Leicester, Massachusetts that's a bit of a hike into the woods, and super old as well. It's also supposed to be really haunted. We drove the half hour in my dad's beat-up Pathfinder down into the middle of nowhere until we came to the path that led deeper into the woods where this cemetery was. I parked right across the street from it. The car wouldn't even lock because it was so old and beat up, so we had to just leave it there and take the keys with us. We smoked a bowl or two on our way to the cemetery. Once we got there, we were stoned out of our minds. We walked around for a little while, and while the ambience was quite creepy, nothing really happened. We did hear some rustling occasionally and some stuff that was probably just animals or the wind blowing through the trees and making eerie howling sounds, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for such a place. We went to the part of the cemetery where the ground was raised up a bit, like you were standing on a small stage. There were trees surrounding it basically in a circle, and we smoked another bowl there together. We had been there for what must have been 20 minutes or so, just talking, smoking, and laughing about dumb stuff, when we heard these loud, heavy crunches through the leaves and twigs, coming from deeper into the woods, the opposite direction we had come from. It didn't sound like an animal either. We all quieted down and looked over, but it stopped as we did so. We shrugged it off quick. Looking back, this was stupid even if it wasn't a person. The area we live in had some bears, so it could have been quite bad still. We went back to smoking. John and I attempted to pathetically flirt with Maria, while Toby flirted with John, and it was generally just a good vibe. Maria stopped though, and told us to look into the woods suddenly. Right where she was pointing, about 50 to 100 yards away, there was a light. Basically, it looked like someone was holding a flashlight pointed right at us. They were so far away though that it didn't seem the beam was reaching us. A few seconds later though, it went out, and we could hear this really weird high-pitched hyena-like laughing. I'm talking some real crazed, maniacal clown laughing. What the fuck was that? We were miles away from any houses. Before anybody had the chance to say anything else, another light flashed on. This time closer, 50 or so yards to the left of the first one. We could hear sprinting through the woods from the direction of the first light when the second went out with the same creepy laughter. We communally decided to get the hell out of there and started pretty hastily back down the trail. It was an extremely dark night. The clouds were heavy set in front of the moon, so seeing anything besides what our cell phones illuminated in the night was basically impossible. A couple minutes down the path, we started to calm down a bit and discuss what was going on. After a few seconds of calm, though, the heavy footsteps started up behind us in the leaves. We stopped and turned. About 50 feet behind us, only barely visible in the darkness, was the outline of something in the middle of the path. Honestly, I probably would have shit myself if I hadn't been so high. John, being the brave macho guy, stepped out in front and yelled at whatever it was to leave us alone. A light switched on, I'm assuming in the person's hand, and they didn't move. They just stood there holding the light and shining it down on us. John yelled at the person for another 30 seconds or so before they turned off the light and just started to walk away. All the while, that same crazy laughing started coming from far in the woods. We quickly made our way out of there and went back to the car. We got ready to drive as far away as we could, but when we turned the key, nothing. Not even a slow turnover. Nothing at all. John liked to think he knew something about cars, so we all got out while he looked under the hood. The 2 cables that connected the battery were hanging free, and the screws that attached them around the posts or terminals were missing. He didn't know if we could reconnect them without the screws, and honestly, I had no idea either. We decided to try and call for help, only to find there was now no cell service. What the hell were we supposed to do now? We were in the middle of the woods with a dead car and no way to contact anybody. Those creeps surely weren't far behind because we could still hear them laughing like hyenas, playing a manhunt in the forest. Lucky for us, only a minute or so after, a car came down the road and seeing our hood up, pulled to the side to see if we needed help. I was really happy to see it was 2 older women and not some maniacal laughing freak that was also in on it. We gladly accepted the ride from them to the nearest place with cell service and called my parents to come pick us up. Needless to say, they were sort of upset with us for going to the cemetery in the first place, since it was technically trespassing. Also, for abandoning the car there. Overall, they were just glad we were fine after getting in the car with strangers, however nice and innocent they seemed to be. The next day, my dad, Toby, and I went back to get the car. Weirdly, this time we both had cell service. I'm not sure what was going on out there. I'm just glad those 2 old women came by and offered a ride when they did. I'm not exactly sure if they were just having some twisted version of fun, or if they were out to do some actual harm, but I'm glad we didn't have to find out that night. I live in Florida, and I have for quite a long time now. I love animals, and I have a lot of rescue cats in my life. I appreciate any animals very much, and would do anything to protect them. My neighbor has a German Shepherd, and it really is a beautiful dog. She was a nurse and often worked late and even during the middle of the night. She'd leave her kids at her husband's house often, and had the dog tied up outside. That was because she couldn't just come home and let her out when she needed to do her business. On the night in question, it was just past midnight. I was sitting out on the patio, just enjoying the night air. I don't tend to get a lot of good sleep often, so I'm often stuck awake late at night. It was such a hot and humid night out, so I went out wearing shorts and even still sweating in the heat. That was when something weird began to happen. The neighbor's dog was getting really worked up all of a sudden. I could see her and hear her, and she was acting very strange. She was growling and barking and trying to run around, stretching the leash as far as she could. This was quite unusual behavior for her, and it bothered me. This dog was usually very well behaved and calm, and would just kinda sit there. This gave me a bad feeling. Something in my gut told me I should go over and check to make sure everything was okay there. When I got over to the yard, I noticed that the leash had been tied around the patio tables and chairs. I figured she must have gotten tangled up and wrapped the leash around her on accident, and that was upsetting her. We all know a dog that's done that once or twice. That had to be the problem, right? I untangled the dog, fully expecting her to return to normal immediately, but that just didn't happen. The dog was now even more upset, growling, jumping, and barking. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what was bothering her. I thought I would just bring her over to my patio and try to keep her company until her owner came home. I knew my neighbor quite well, so I knew this would be okay with her. That night, there was supposed to be this meteor shower or something. I thought it would be nice to just have a little smoke and watch it with the dog laying next to me. I would remain awake and return the dog when the owner got home. I think it may have been about a half hour of us sitting there together when I heard the most horrifying, bizarre noise I'd ever heard. At first, I thought it was a motorcycle backfiring or something like that, but I lived in a subdivision, and the sound was a lot closer to me than the street had been. I wish I could tell you exactly what the noise was, Both before and after, I've never heard anything quite as terrifying. As I listened further, I realized it was some sort of animal growl. It was a nastier growl than anything I'd ever heard before. I took out my phone and shined the flashlight. My heart jumped in my chest when I found out just what had made that noise and why the dog was so upset. There was a 10-foot-long gator skulking about the yard, and it was very close to us. I don't know if you've ever been close to a gator that big, but I'm not Crocodile Kevney. I wanted no part in this. I grabbed the dog off my lap immediately. She must have known that gator was hiding there the whole time. I was scared to make any moves. Not the best response to a gator to try and run away. My fight or flight played rock, paper, scissors, and flight won in that moment though. I held the dog and sprinted to the sliding glass door. I got in and slammed it shut, without daring to look back at that gator. As I locked everything up though, I took a little glance back just to see. That gator was right there on my porch in front of the door. It had tried to chase us as we ran for safety, and I only just barely made it. That night, the dog slept in my house. My cats weren't the happiest about it, of course, but there was no way I was going to let him outside with that gator out there. You hear all kinds of stories about scary humans, ghosts, demons, witches, and things like that on YouTube. But be that close to a gator, and trust me, it will scare the shit out of you much worse than any of those things. This is a true story, detailing something that happened to my wife and I 3 years ago. My wife and I lived in a renovated pool house on my uncle's property, up in a secluded posh neighborhood in the mountains of SoCal. The community was quiet, given the economic status of the residents, and the fact it was several miles up the mountain and far away from the urban neighborhoods. The community was also gated, keeping it even more secluded. That being the case, the only real traffic was people who lived there already, coming up to their McMansions. There were 2 ways up the mountain, one approach from the south and one from the west. Either way, you have to drive up several miles of narrow, windy, one-lane roads that both lead up to these razorback ridges in order to reach the community gates. For those who don't know, a razorback ridge is a narrow ridge with a steep 100-foot or more drop to the bottom. So this night, my wife and I are hanging out with a family who live down the mountain in the San Bernardino Valley. We're out until about midnight, when we decided it was about time to head home now. We started driving. As time goes on, the houses and street lamps get more sparse, and the darkness encroaches as we hit the base of the mountain. As we started to drive up, the street lights were now absent, as well as the lights of the houses. There was nothing but darkness and our 2 headlights illuminating the way. About halfway up, a thick fog started to develop, not too uncommon for the area. A little dangerous for us though, given how windy it was and how late at night it was too. Many people had driven off those windy roads on accident on nights like this, and died in the valleys below, even if there wasn't fog out that had happened. I slowed down and stayed extra attentive to what was in front of us. The steep part of the ascent was soon over, and we reached the Razorback Ridge, just a few more miles till we arrived home. When we reached the top, the road leveled out. The fog now grew even thicker, limiting my visibility to 100 feet or so. Suddenly, I made out a large shape in the middle of the fog. It caught the reflection of my headlights, bouncing off a mirrored surface. I slowed down and came to see a new silver Mazda crossover in the road. The car was not merely parked in the shoulder though, or even in the traffic lane. It was parked diagonally right across the middle. The back half of the car was in the lane opposite to us, and the front half was in our lane. It was as if someone had come from the opposite direction, veered onto our side, and just stopped right there. This was particularly odd. That meant either someone came from our community several miles further down the way, or had driven all the way up the approach from the mountain bypassing our community, which was the only thing really up there. In either case, it made no sense for this car we'd never seen to be coming out this way this late at night, and to have stopped this expensive car right in the road as well. I could see the car was also empty. All lights were off, doors were completely shut, the car was not running, and nobody seemed to be nearby either. No flashlights shining, nobody calling for a lost dog, no flat tires. Just the road, the fog, the silence, this empty car, and my headlights. As I slowed down and we approached the scene, I absorbed it in. The only thing I could think was, this is a trap. Every horror movie and survival video game I'd ever played told me that bandits or creepy creatures were gonna pop out real soon. That being the case, I retrieved my handgun and stopped the car, but didn't put it in park yet. My wife was also taken aback. What the heck is this? I said I wasn't sure, and I was going to call out to see if anyone needed help. Despite this creepiness, part of me thought there must be a rational explanation. Surely with a scene like this, someone must need some help. I cracked the window down a bit and listened in. No voices, no wind, just the soft hum of my own engine, which went into eco mode when stopped. "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response. "Do you need some help maybe?" Nothing. I started to clench my pistol's grip tighter and moved my finger slightly closer from the slide to the trigger, anticipating anything. Still, there was nothing though. After having been there a minute in total, I said the dumbest thing in my life. I turned to my wife and said, "Hey, you think I should get out and check what's going on here?" My wife looked at me like the dumbest ass I was and said, "Let's go now." Even to this day, I still feel dumb for saying that. As soon as it left my lips, I realized I was sounding exactly like a generic horror movie extra about to get killed in the first 5 minutes. At that point, I realized it was time to go. I did my best to slowly drive around the car, trying not to fall off that damn cliff, scanning for movement in the fog and the vehicle. Nothing the entire time. We finished our drive home and talked a little bit, then went to bed. For the next week, I checked the Facebook community pages and local news for anything connected to this. Maybe a missing persons report, or a missing dog alert or something. Even just anyone else who saw that car. But nothing came up. I drove that path again, and even dozen more times at that same hour, but I never saw that car again either. I still don't know what this was about. I can't rationalize it without copping out that it was just some elaborate prank or something. That seems impossible and ridiculous though. To be honest, it seemed like the road was intentionally blocked. But why would someone block the road intentionally with such an expensive car on this windy, dangerous mountain road in the middle of the night in a severe fog, and then not even come to check on their trap or whatever? It's a strange and creepy mystery to this day. This is a close call with a stranger I had when I was younger. It's something I didn't fully realize the severity of until I was much older. My mom had left me and my brother home alone this day. It was around midday, I think. My brother was 12, maybe 13, and I was 9 years old. I was just kinda watching him play Xbox in our living room. He had his headset on and was talking to his friends when there was a knock on the door from our carport. I ran over and answered the door without even looking. It was a grown man I had never seen before. We were still separated by the screen door, but at the time it was unlocked. "Hey there, Missy. Are your parents home?" A bit of horror washed over me. First of all, he was knocking from the carport, which was strange in and of itself. Wouldn't a stranger go knock on your front door? Our carport was empty as well. We only had one car, and my mother had taken it out. The man definitely knew my parents weren't home. I was afraid. I wasn't quite sure why yet, but I knew I was scared. Immediately, my brother in the other room came to mind. I never had a father figure growing up. My brother had always been the one to make me feel safe. The strongest person in the entire world to me. Someone who could protect me in any situation. But he was doing something else right now. I began to feel as though I could barely speak. Wide-eyed, I managed to at least stutter out, My big brother's here." Without even a moment's pause, though, the man reached for the screen door and started to pull it open. Like an act of divine intervention, an arm reached out behind me over my shoulder and grabbed the door. My brother rushed past me, holding the door and forcing the man back. The man sprinted out of the carport and closed the door behind him. The man came back around to the front and told my brother he was looking to buy some shitty old swing set that was in our front yard at the time. My brother came back in without saying anything to me. He put on his headset and continued playing. I sat down as well and continued to watch him, and the man left soon after. I don't believe we ever told our mom. Luckily, I never encountered this person again, and it almost faded from my memory. As I got older and started to understand more, though, it became one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. Maybe creepy not so much because of what actually happened, but what easily could have. It was unnerving how absolutely oblivious both of us were. I like to think the man was planning to just lock me in a room, rob the place, and leave immediately after. But who knows? People can be so evil. So my boyfriend recently moved to the city and got this room in this student building. To explain, we have 3 different levels and each level is exactly the same. 4 individual doors with individual locks. Each door is a separate room you can rent. So, you share shower, toilet, and kitchen. Overall, it's kinda like having your own place though. More like an apartment than a house really. He lives on the 3rd floor, and we recently bought a cabinet for his place. We were lifting the cabinet through the front door when this guy comes into the building with us. We politely let him pass us by because lifting this damn thing up the stairs was going to take a hell of a lot of time. I smiled at the man and waved hello. Then I saw his face. Legit, all my stranger danger alarms started going off right away. He had this strange smile, like a smug, satisfied thing. He towered over me. I could see his dirty mustache, which was barely even considered one. It was the kind of thing 14-year-olds would grow. Nothing really there yet, just some dirty hairs. We noticed that he'd gone to the 2nd floor, so lucky for us. My boyfriend and I tried to ignore him. Once we got upstairs, though, we both agreed he creeped us out quite a bit. We tried not to judge and just let it pass us over. A week or so later, we had a dog over. We go and walk him in the evening. It was still light outside at this time. Anyway, we started to walk back to the building when we spotted that same creepy guy from before. He was kinda just walking in slow motion, not a care in the world, completely oblivious to everything. That's not what creeped us out though. Looking at his face, there was no way he was sober. He was completely away from this world, very visibly on drugs. In that moment, the way he walked and the way he looked, I got really bad vibes from him. I didn't want to get close to him at all. My boyfriend and I decided to not walk back with him to the building. We took another route instead, just to avoid being close to him. We sure took our time, too, to make sure he was in his room before we entered. This is the real creepy part. I have to give you some background information now. 3 weeks before our first encounter with this guy, someone had been randomly murdered while jogging near the school campus. Stabbed in the back. Died instantly. The suspect had been seen at the time near the campus, so a drawing had been released. They didn't have him though, and didn't really have much to work with. It was all very vague. Just today, my boyfriend and I got back from his work at 4 in the afternoon when we noticed someone in a suit standing outside. Didn't really think much of it at first. Later that night though, the guy who lived next door caught me as I got back from the bathroom and asked me if we already had a key of the front door. I said yes we did and asked why. The police had had to break the door down apparently, so he was in charge of getting everyone new keys. My boyfriend at the time joined us, together with the person who lived on the other side, and asked what happened. Apparently that guy who killed the person near campus was that guy living on the 2nd floor. I asked if I could see how he looked. He told me he was tall, black hair, weird mustache, looked kinda dirty. My boyfriend and I were in utter shock. We'd lived so close to a murderer. Someone who'd been around us at night, who cooked his dinner in the shared kitchen while he took someone else's life. Someone I smiled and waved hello to, and later tried to avoid. So let me start off by saying I move around a lot in between SoCal and Arizona. At the time of this story, December 2015, I was still living in Southern California at my grandma's apartments. I'd gotten a seasonal job at Toys R Us to do something with my time and learn some people skills. I'm a 24-year-old girl and have pretty extreme social anxiety. I find it really hard to talk to people sometimes, so I figured this job would help me out a bit. Another important thing to mention, my grandmother is on a government program with reduced housing cost and has a 2-bedroom apartment ever since my grandfather passed away. Due to the annual check at her complex though, she's supposed to be the only inhabitant of her dwelling. Technically, I was not supposed to be living there with her, but she liked the help and company, and I liked being rent-free. Since I wasn't supposed to be there though, I technically had to sneak around, and most definitely could not park on the parking grounds for the complex, as it would draw quite a bit of attention. Luckily, there was a cemetery just across the street from the complex, then a half-mile of houses leading down the street next to the cemetery, along which most of the visitors for the houses and apartments nearby parked. I was getting rent-free and staying with my grandma, which was awesome to me, even if it meant I had to park half a mile away and walk. So, all was well for a few months, from when I got the job in October, minus a scary incident with a stalker at work. Eventually though, they started putting me on night shifts, which I definitely didn't mind since I tended to be a night owl anyway. Also, if you've ever been on closing shift at any retail store, you know you can easily stay an hour or two overtime after the store closes, doing reshop during holiday season. It was early December at the time, so I ended up getting off work past 2 a.m. Around this hour at this time of year in this part of SoCal, the mist gets unbearably thick, to the point of having to drive 30 miles per hour down the freeway with brights on, and still being unable to see even a foot or two in front of your car. Tonight was one of those nights. I wasn't too bothered by it at the time though. It did set off my anxiety a little bit, so by the time I got home it took me nearly 20 minutes to find a parking space. I was pretty anxious. Of course, with my luck, I had to park at the very end of the half-mile stretch. Now, it was kind of a tradition of mine when I got out of the car, to close the door and linger nearby for a minute while I audibly stretched a bit, and sometimes complained about my day. Just a little habit thing I did. Tonight was no different. I immediately tucked my purse under my arm, turned on my phone flashlight and stuck it in front of my face to see where the hell I was going. The fog was so thick I couldn't even see my hand right in front of me. I had walked in this weather many times before, so I knew my way home by heart. A straight shot walk for half a mile, and a sharp turn left at the very end of the cemetery, then crossing the street and into the gated complex. I was on my merry way, until I heard it. A loud, almost obnoxious cough, and footsteps approaching. My alert mode set in right away. I started walking faster instantly, trying to be a lot quieter about my movements. Call me paranoid, but I've had my fair number of creepy moments. I certainly wasn't keen about meeting this stranger walking behind me. Especially so given I couldn't even see a foot in front of my face even with the streetlights and my cell phone flashlight. This continued for a few minutes, with an occasional cough from behind me. Then I'd hear a whistle, the kind cat callers do. This bewildered me because 1, you can't see fish, and 2, since you can't see fish in this weather, I assumed this person must be purposefully intimidating me. At this point, I gave up on walking altogether and broke into a sprint. I could hear the person behind me break into a full-blown run as well. I could hear panting now. Clearly, this person was not in the best shape. Neither was I, honestly, but the run didn't win me out nearly as bad. By now, I was speed-walking next to the cemetery. For some godforsaken reason, my panicked mind told me it would be better to duck in there and hide, instead of just walking straight home. Had there been no fog, I would have had a clear view of my grandma's apartment from the area where I stood. I quickly hid by crouching behind the entrance post to the cemetery gates. I knew I fucked up right away. His footsteps stopped too. I could tell he knew I was hiding, because he couldn't hear me walking anymore. I crouched there for what seemed like 10 minutes, too scared to turn on my phone, for fear of him being close enough to see the light and find me. Too scared to make a run for it, for fear that he was still listening out for my steps. I had figured out he was standing probably 5 to 10 feet from where I was at the entrance driveway to the cemetery, right before the gates, which was confirmed when minutes later I heard him call out, "I know you're there, sweetheart." I heard the distinct sound of a lighter being struck and then smelled cigarette smoke. I figured this guy was now focused on his cigarette, so I made a run for it across the cemetery, somehow not tripping over any graves. The cemetery's main entrance was wrought iron fencing, but the back and right end were wooden and served as a separator between the cemetery and backyards of various houses. The other side, which was in front of my grandmother's apartment, was chain link. There was no other entrance or exit. I did know, though, that the chain link fence didn't go all the way to the ground. I laid down on my stomach, pushed the fence up and out, and wriggled across. I ran directly across the street to my grandma's house, pounding on the door until she opened. I don't know how this dude even found me. He must have been standing around nearby as I parked, and heard me complaining to myself loudly when I got out of the car. Either way, that was one of the most terrifying experiences I ever had. Let me preface this encounter with a bit of background, as I'll most likely post more of my encounters later. You see, I'm in my mid-20s, but due to my father's work, I've been all over the globe. In the space of 11 years, from 8-ish to around 19, I lived for varying amounts of time in 5 different countries, while visiting about 6 or 7 more. All of this is not even including my home country, and very short holidays as well. Coupled with my bipolarity, type 1 with rare MDEs, and functioning insomnia, it made me keep a meticulous journal from the moment I could write. This has also allowed me to have a whole truckload of experiences that make me feel very fortunate. Of course, for all the good, there's some bad ones mixed in every now and then. For the past 10 months or so, I've worked as a night porter in a pretty well-known hotel in a medium-sized city in the UK. This place has been around for decades and is immensely popular for its funeral teas and wakes, as morbid as that might be. This is because it's right across the road from one of the larger local cemeteries, about 1 kilometer from one of the larger churches, and to top it off, less than 3 kilometers from the crematorium. It's perfectly situated for the mourner's business, to say. So, a couple of weeks ago, I had almost finished up my shift when the sweet old guy that's the cemetery's groundskeeper came in, on the verge of tears. His name is Jacob, and he was the epitome of an adorable, kind old man. He even volunteered to work there, even though he was retired. That's just how nice he was. Yeah, Jacob came in about 7:50, as I was waiting for the morning shift folks to turn up so I could go home. He started blabbering incoherently, as emotionally overwhelmed people tend to do. I tried to calm him down, and asked if he wanted a cuppa. Obviously, that was a yes. 5 minutes later, he was sat down with a cup of tea, telling me about what was wrong. Some idiot had jumped the fence and overturned a bunch of headstones, and spray-painted vile bark on the epitaphs, even partially dug into some graves. By the time he'd calmed down fully, I said my shift was finished now, and I told him I'd help him get them upright at the very least. The man was just too nice, but I couldn't just leave him like this. Roll on a couple of hours and all the stones were back in order. I went home shattered. Those things are heavy as hell. I was happy to have helped, though. I told my work I'd probably be a little late the next morning, and they understood. Anyway, I get to my shift a couple hours late. Turns out I'm going to be on my own after 2, as my colleague's second job needed him in early as hell. 2 a.m. comes around. Everything was almost in order. I was just adding the finishing touches to a large funeral tea in one of our function suites when I heard a knocking noise. At first, I thought it was someone in the room upstairs walking the halls or something, and dismissed it. But the knocking happened again, and became slowly louder. 3rd time's the charm, I suppose. I found the source, one of the fire exits next to the function suite. More specifically, the fire exit directly across from the cemetery. Obviously, I was not going to open that door. I couldn't even if I wanted to. They were all alarmed at night. That didn't matter though, as the knocking suddenly stopped. Not for long though. It started again from another fire exit, closer to the car park and front exit. It was much louder now, so I knew exactly where it was coming from straight away. It stopped again. In a minor panic, I sprinted my way towards the front door and made sure it was locked. Then I grabbed the night porter's best friend from behind reception, a walking stick. I could see my visitor's silhouette in the car park, walking slowly towards the entrance in the darkness. Definitely a man, at least a foot taller and a little bit broader than I was. He was wearing one of those stupid ankle-length goth trench coats with a hood and buckles by the billionfold. The man stopped just outside the light. He was obviously staring at me. I could faintly make out a creepy, shit-eating grin on his face. He started to take something from behind his back. I braced, wondering what he was going to do. It looked like he had a very large brick or something. I thought he was about to smash the front door open and attack me, but instead he did something far stranger. He placed this brick-like thing on the ground slowly at his feet. Then, with a very weirdly chipper demeanor, he waved and flashed a toothy grin at me before fading away into the darkness towards the cemetery side entrance. Needless to say, I waited and checked the cameras around the building before venturing out to see what he'd left there. It ended up being one of those small headstone markers with the words, "You forgot this one," sprayed all over it in bright green paint. To add even more creep factor, the stone was for a bloody baby's grave, and an old one at that. Not cool at all. I locked up again and phoned the police. A couple hours later, and a lot of footage from the CCTV scanned, the police left with only a fuzzy frame shot of him that was basically a shape of darkness on darkness, and nothing else to go by. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.